I believe we can be a more powerful country.
The election of John F. Kennedy marks the end of the first phase in the Cold War. In setting a new course, Kennedy runs head-on into the powerful and often dangerous alliances that were part of America's Cold War legacy.
Castro marks the second anniversary of his revolution with the biggest military parade ever staged in Cuba, featuring tanks and other heavy weapons from Russia and Red Czechoslovakia. Shortly afterwards, Castro demanded the United States Embassy drastically reduce its staff to 11 persons. It was the last straw in his long campaign of provocation and harassment. President Eisenhower broke off diplomatic relations with a message read by Press Secretary Haggerty.
There is a limit to what the United States and self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached. Our friendship for the Cuban people is not affected. It is my hope and my conviction that in the not-too-distant future, it will be possible for the historic friendship between us once again to find reflection in normal relations of every sort. Meanwhile, our sympathy goes out to the people of Cuba, now suffering under the yoke of a dictator.
Kennedy enters the White House in the midst of plans for the invasion of Cuba. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had set a basic anti-Castro policy, which was to be overseen by Allen Dulles at the CIA and then Vice President Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Kennedy only thought about getting elected. That is to say, he's the definition of the opportunist. He comes into office in early 1960, having made more militant speeches against Castro and communism in Cuba even than Richard Nixon had made. I think not because he had a spiritual passion against Castro or even against communism as such, but because his calculus of the relativity of forces had persuaded him that that's what he needed to do to get elected. These were pigeons that would come home to roost, and they started coming home to roost right away when the first thing that he and his brother Robert, the Attorney General, found out, to their surprise certainly, and very likely to their dismay, that the very program that they had implicitly been calling for vis-a-vis Castro in Cuba was in fact afoot. That is to say that there was all along a secret program, not secret from Nixon, of course, designed to land on Cuba's beaches an invasion force of anti-Castro Cubans with the backing of the U.S. Navy and Air Force.
Kennedy represents the fundamental liberal dilemma over the revolutionary national liberation movements worldwide. He shares the hardline Cold War mentality that projected American power everywhere, while displaying the pragmatic understanding that revolution is fueled by poverty and suffering.
Today, our concern must be with that future. For the world is changing, the old era is ending, the old ways will not do. Abroad, the balance of power is shifting. New and more terrible weapons are coming into use. 1/3 of the world may be free, but 1/3 is the victim of a cruel repression, and the other third is rocked by poverty and hunger and disease. Communist influence has penetrated into Asia. It stands in the Middle East and now festers some 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Cuba is the key to U.S. strategic control of the Caribbean. The U.S. has a long history of intervention in Cuban affairs dating back to the 19th century. Astoundingly, in the immediate post-war period, organized crime, although under attack in the continental United States, becomes an agent of American policy and interest in Cuba. All of this is accomplished through intensive investment in the Cuban economy and through a system of bribery overseen by the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Havana, in the post-war period, becomes the sin capital of the Caribbean, through the sponsorship of American business interests linked to organized crime.
The single largest source of income for the mafia in the 1950s were the gambling casinos in Havana and the prostitution. I mean, all drug dealing. Havana was where they got most of their income, so they want to get back there.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban Army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases. 2 of the B-26 light bombers then seek asylum in Florida. On the heels of the air raids, landings were effected by rebels at several places on the Cuban coast, and the rebellion against the red-tinged dictator was on, with the refugee pilot claiming a full-scale army revolt near. In Havana, Acting Foreign Minister Olivares shows diplomats rockets fired from the Cuban raiders, which he claims have U.S. markings. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Cuban Foreign Minister Roa accused the United States of unleashing a war of invasion. Roa says the invading soldiers trained in Florida, but Ambassador Stevenson makes a quick denial.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
Kennedy, with the advice of the CIA, makes a disastrous miscalculation, one which will cost him politically and end the careers of CIA operatives Allen Dulles and General Charles Cabell.
Allen Dulles had been the director of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time of the Bay of Pigs. He was fired by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs and basically had his whole career ruined by the president, and justifiably so. But in one of the most inexcusable turn of events in the history of the United States, he was named one of the 7 Warren Commission members, and one of the president's strongest enemies got to be one of the 7 people who got to choose the historical version of what happened to him. I think that's absolutely unforgivable. General Charles Cabell was another of those people that was fired at the same time as Allen Dulles by President Kennedy. He hated President Kennedy, felt he was a traitor, and never forgave him. It should be mentioned that his brother, Earl Cabell, was the mayor of Dallas at the time of the assassination and was involved in the planning of the motorcade route.
Kennedy, leery of the project from its inception, is convinced that he has been betrayed by the CIA.
Once he saw the scope of the Bay of Pigs invasion planned for April of 1961, and once he was in a position to do something about it, he became quite negative, became quite critical, insisted that the American hand be as concealed as possible, canceled the military's plans to make a showing of the fleet as the Cubans were put ashore, canceled the plans to use American air power in the support of the beachhead, and in effect undermined the Bay of Pigs invasion program, despite the fact that he seemed to have spent his campaign calling for it.
The debacle at the Bay of Pigs sets in motion a series of events which will culminate in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Castro, now clearly fearful of an American invasion, strikes an arms deal with the Soviet Union. For the first time, Russian nuclear missiles are stationed on Cuban soil. Kennedy's ultimatum to the Soviets brings the world to the brink of nuclear war. In return for Soviet withdrawal, Kennedy pledges that the U.S. will never invade Cuba. Having guaranteed Cuban sovereignty, Kennedy again alienates the right wing and the internal forces which represent them within the U.S. government.
William Harvey was a very rough CI officer, made it up quite high, Cuba desk officer. Rough guy carrying pearl-handled pistols, colorful guy who was proud of his criminal ties, his criminal associations from childhood. From the Cuba desk, he created, under orders, the ZR rifle, the CI's formal, to my knowledge, the only formal assassination unit that operated in the United States, at least. And to give you a measure of how far he went in his criminal mind, his criminal activities, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy was bluffing nuclear war and sweating blood, if it ignited and we went to war, Washington would have been vaporized. He was worrying at that level. William Harvey was jamming teams into Cuba to provoke Fidel, and the key in the provocation, Daniel Ellsberg got this when he went to Russia in a conference discussing the missile crisis. What had the Russians so scrambling so quickly to resolve it, we had told them that if we were blinded, if the U-2s were shot down, that we would call that an act of war and respond. And Fidel controlled the missiles on the ground in Cuba that could shoot down the U-2s. So the Russians were desperate to get this thing over with without conferring with Fidel very quickly. And William Harvey was jamming teams into Cuba to provoke Fidel so he would do something that would guarantee we would go to war with him.
So we've come here